In these kinds of pre-concert chats, my favorite thing to do is to say a little bit about what you're about to hear, but after all, you're about to hear it, so I don't think we need to say too much. You'll hear it in about an hour. So let's talk about how we get into an experience like the one you're about to hear. And so let's talk for about 20 minutes among ourselves, but if you have questions, I urge you to remember them, and that at a certain point, happy to answer them if you have them. So Tamara, the first question is for you. I mean, exactly how long has it been that we have been talking about doing this piece?
I cannot remember. It's been at least 10 years, I think, that I had this idea for a piece and percussion solo. You were my idol for many years, so I couldn't think of something better, somebody better than Steve. And not only your amazing percussionist, musician, conductor, but also you have, I don't want to give too much of the piece, but you have all the other requirements.
I would urge you to lower your expectations after that very generous. Approximately 14%, I think that would be just about. I just cannot see anything. This is, yeah, we'll do something like this. Yeah, so we've been talking about this for a long time, and one of the things that I most admire in your percussion writing is how you blend colors. So the percussion setup itself, which is at the core of any percussion piece. What are the instruments chosen by the composer? How do they meld together? What kind of sound world? And what you've done is to create simultaneously, this is really quite a trick, simultaneously an incredibly varied set of instruments, but also a set of instruments which blends well together. So it's as though it expands into a kind of state of multiplicity, if you'll pardon that expression, but they can also contract into this very focused, almost melodic. So how do you do it? It's really impressive.
I must say that it's something spontaneous that I cannot even really explain. I know that I was terrified of writing this piece for a long time, so every time I said, okay, I got to start it, and it didn't happen because for me, writing a percussion, something for percussion solo or percussion and ensemble, it seems to me like the harder thing for a composer, because any other instrument has a melody, harmony, that we can hear, understand immediately, but how can you create something for percussion, which if I'm not talking about the instrument with pitch, so marimba, vibraphone, which you will see in the piece, that is easy, fairly easy, right? But all the other instruments, how do you create a melody, sometimes which is built by different kinds of percussion. So if you have, if in a violin, if you have a melody of 6 notes, da 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 da, in the percussion it could be,
You nailed it.
So how do you do it?
Well, can I answer the question? Because that's actually a legitimate question, which is to say, how does a composer develop an aural imagination for instruments that she or he has not had hands-on experience? It's not just percussion, it's the fact that I'm using my instruments that are in my studio that are really separate from other people's instruments. And so what Tamara and I did, well, first of all, we've known each other for a long time, as you've gathered, but then Tamara would describe the kind of sound, the behavior of a sound, and I would say, I think that this could function in the way you want it to. And sometimes that was exactly what you had written, in other words, a certain size of cymbal or gong. At other times it was a change of instrument altogether, but the functionality of the sound remained the same. So there is a kind of built-in dialogue and collaboration when you deal with percussion, just by virtue of the fact that, well, I'll give you an example. If a composer writes for small gong, that would be a fairly straightforward thing to see as a percussionist. I can think of about 75 different versions of small gong. They could come from Burma or Bali or Japan or even Africa. They could be made of different kinds of metal. They could be made of wood, they could be played with hard sticks or so. I mean, when you start adding the amount of variety that's inherent in something simple and seemingly mutually understandable, like small gong, then you have an idea of what the complexity is for creating a percussion score. We'll come back up to the nuts and bolts of the piece, but as you said, without giving too much away, but I want to talk to Danny just a little bit, because and I don't know exactly how to ask you these evocative questions in such a way that the surprise that will be the sculpture you've made still holds. But you've made this extraordinary wooden sculpture, and I wonder if you would just tell us a little bit about how it functions and where it came from in your work.
So I've been creating this art, not just visual art, as a sculpture under the title that's called digital interactive art. So all of the pieces are digital. There's computer technology behind them. This particular piece is from 1999. It's one of my earlier pieces. And it's made out of 821, I believe, wooden tiles that are all motorized and they move, you'll see. And I developed it as a visual piece to create something that I think of as a mirror, and you'll understand later, hopefully, why I think about it as a mirror. But byproduct of that was that all of these mirrors operating together create a sound, which is kind of a byproduct of it that I almost dismissed. But Tamara picked up on that and saw the potential of actually using that to create music. So that's really the seed that had to germinate for this piece to happen. And that happened almost immediately. Tamara and I are partners in life as well. So she has known these pieces from the late 1990s. And in her mind, I think, it started developing. About 10 years ago, it had the potential of starting to be a reality, and then contacting Steve and everything in the festival to happen.
And so one of the questions that was posed to me by the organizers of this concert here at SummerFest, La Jolla Music Society, was, could you talk a little bit about how this piece fits in with Mozart and chanson? And that's a taller order than you might think. Except I began to think about it, and there's a really obvious way, and that is that chamber music is essentially about interaction. It's about the interaction with your partners, and it's also essentially about an interaction with yourself. A musical imagination that you build and that is then realized on your instrument. And standing in front of your mirror, I realized that you had set up a chamber music dynamic, which is not new at all, which in fact can be traced through the history of music to the earliest kinds of ensemble and communal pieces. And so at the same time, and again, this is all in advance of you having seen the sculpture, but I look at the mirror and I am confronted simultaneously with something completely other than myself. A wooden rectangular box about 8 by 8 or something like that with the 871 wooden tiles in it. It feels completely non-human. It's driven by digital technology. And the instant you move in front of it and the camera captures what you do, and that's translated into MIDI signal and changes the tiles so that they reflect in various ways light to create the image of what the mirror sees in wood. This is crazy. You are dealing suddenly not with this foreign element, you're dealing with yourself. And the mediation between you and yourself through the medium of otherness, if you'll pardon that expression, is really, for me, the poetic axis of peace.
And one of the, maybe the biggest question marks before embarking on this journey is that there is something very intimate in the way people interact with my pieces, because they are reflective, and usually it's one person interacting with themselves, mediated by the piece, like you said. And our question was, would that translate?
Yeah.
Two things. One is that it's not us, the audience, that are interacting, but you are our agent in interacting on our behalf.
Right.
So will that feel still that intimate? And the other thing, of course, is the scale. And I think the auditorium here in La Jolla is perfectly sized also. So you're close enough to the piece, and it kind of feels still intimate. And it'll be you that'll have to answer if that worked, but that was a big concern.
Well, speaking of scale and intimacy, Tamar, back to you and the aural, the musical component of this. The piece is scored for percussion soloist and an ensemble of 9 musicians, and we face each other across the stage with a mirror in between us. How did you deal with the question of musical intimacy, knowing, for example, that your soloist would be very far apart from the ensemble with whom he would be interacting? Were there musical strategies to deal with that?
Well, you know, with some concertis, it's very clear that there is a soloist and ensemble.
Mm-hmm.
So the soloist stands in front. You can definitely hear that the soloist has the mute, the melody, the line, the orchestra accompanies. Here, sometimes it is like that, but sometimes it's not. The way I hear it, and I hope that you will all hear it as well, is that sometimes, even if it's not, even if you don't hear the melody, because there is not a specific melody, there is something that the ensemble is doing, but it's not necessarily a melody and a company. Still, your part is very complex, and I see that as a solo. You know, for some people, maybe it will sound as if the percussion just accompany the ensemble, and that is not what that is not how I hear it, because the solo part is so complex and so significant that I hear it totally as a solo.
Does it seem possible, the way we were just describing percussion as this thing that can be complex and different and full of kaleidoscopic contradictions almost, and at the same time, if you play it, or perhaps if you listen to it in a certain way, it can collapse into a unified sound field. Perhaps that's also what you've set up, that there are moments at which the soloist, so to speak, and the ensemble really are practically in different spaces, but at moments, even across this bridge of space that we have between us, there is a kind of complicity. Feels like that's what you're doing to some extent.
Right. Well, you know, if I may, if you have time, I'll just tell you a little story. Probably by the end of the story, I won't remember why the story. But I remember when I was at Yale, a student. I took one lesson with Frederick Krzyzewski, he just passed away unfortunately recently. He was an amazing pianist and composer based in Belgium. And he was a guest composer at the department, and we all could take one lesson, private lesson with him. And I knew that I was at the end of the day. I knew that he must be tired. I said, okay, I'll just play just a short movement from a piece, and I could see that he's listening, but I couldn't figure out, is he happy? Is he not happy? And then when it ended, he was completely serious, and he asked me, "Are you taking drugs?"
And if so, do you have any? We all knew Frederick. Bless him.
No, I mean, I really had no idea at the time why he asked that, because it's nothing is very strange about this piece. I couldn't understand where this question came from. But then he said that it sounded to him like that sometimes there is something so spontaneous that it sometimes you can hear almost something for ballet or opera that has a story behind it. And I told him that no, that this is how I work, and sometimes how I speak, and I have very deep, quick association of something, and I'm going here with the conversation, people sometimes losing me. And I think that that is also in music, that it's, as you said, sometimes it's together, and then it's not,
suddenly disjunct, or, yeah, that's amazing, good. So the structure of the piece, and this will go back to you, Danny, because the mirror has such a presence in the stagecraft and the theatricality of the piece, but we don't hear from it for a little while. And so, can you talk a little bit about? Well, the question I want to ask is something like the amount of patience it takes to engage something which has so many moving parts.
Right.
How do you? how do we resist rushing up and seeing what it can do all at once? And you've created this really beautifully. So can you talk about the role of patience in your work?
Of course. You know, I'm very lucky, I think, as are you, Steven, not so much Tamar, that the work that we do, the craft of it is very obvious.
Mm-hmm.
When we see you play, we understand that this craft, we can't do that. And I think there's something about the craft of building this piece also. People say, wow, you have so much patience, or how did you do that? Versus, for example, most of the work that I do is actually digital on the computer, and most people can't at all understand the craft that goes into that. So, so for me, actually, I'm kind of happy that the piece is there on the stage for what it is as a sculpture, even without functioning for a while. And it is there, I think it's beautiful, and when I try to engage people in interaction, I think about it as a series of attractions. And the first in that series of attractions is physical beauty. The fact that the piece is made of a beautiful material. I think about its proportions like a sculptor. And then perhaps, and you will see actually on the stage, it will be maybe on that order, when you move in front of the piece, it responds. So suddenly it's an object that moves. That's another kind of pulling you into the sculpture. And then you see that it's interactive. You're moving and it's moving with you. Wow. And then you see yourself, you know, people, that's all they want to do is see themselves. So then, then you're hooked. So this is kind of the progression. And the piece actually goes a little bit to that. And the big surprise, which is new, because only with Tamara involvement it could do that, is that, and you'll see that, of course, in tonight's concert, is that after it is being interacted with by Steve, the piece takes a life of its own, a musical life of its own, and that has never been the case in any of my pieces. So the piece today is taking another step up in consciousness, or
via pre-programmed rhythms against which the percussion part is in contrapuntal juxtaposition. Yeah. But you know, you said something, I never really quite thought of it this way, but I do think that there is something about the percussive art and what you do that's very common, which is that most of the work is kind of arcane. The stuff that you do is completely inscrutable. The things that I do every day in my studio would be inscrutable to a music listening audience. You know, trying 5 different mouths and 5 different parts of a cymbal, for example. What in the world is he doing? Yet on stage, the mechanics of playing percussion are absolutely self-evident. And in the best of scenarios, they communicate to the listener that, yes, you also could do this. And when you think, oh, I could do this also, I don't take offense at that. I don't think, oh, no, I studied at the university for 10 years, you don't understand. No, it's not that. I think that's great if you think you also could do this. And of course, that's the thing that comes out in the mirror. You think, oh, this is in a way kind of simple. But of course, what's behind this is these layers of arcana. And I think that's just fascinating. You know, we've spoken for, not to be too precise, 17.35 minutes. And perhaps you have some questions and comments, and I would just urge you to phrase your question in the form of a question. Does anybody have anything that you would like to ask Tamara or Danny? Oh yes, thank you.
Right at the beginning, Tamara, you were talking about the role of selecting an instrument for its timbre and tone. And it reminded me a lot of today's electronic music producers and composers, where sound design seems to be as much a piece of the work as writing the melodies, harmonies, and so forth. Do you think that's a trend that's really happening across music today? Is the selection of timbre and tone and sound design a greater factor today than it used to be because of what we have access to? How does it change the compositional process to have all those tools at your disposal?
Let me repeat the question. Just in case somebody couldn't hear in the back. So the question is of sound design, and does the choice of timbre, the choice of sound, is that growing in proportion in this sort of compositional art, and how does Tamara in particular deal with those possibilities?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think that in the 1950s, at that time, people were, even later, people were really looking into sound, and there was this place in an institute, ILCAM in France, where we really sat there and designed sounds from scratch, actually. So people were still doing it very excessively in the 70s, 80s. Actually, I think that now it's coming back more. People are looking for melody, less interested in, not always, of course, and some people are doing, and I think in Europe you would find more people that are looking into really sound. But here it's, I don't treat the percussion instrument as a few instruments with different sounds. For me, it's like totally like people. And this is how I write my music. This is maybe why Frederick Chevsky thought that it sounds as a program music, because I see them as really people. So if Steve has and then boom on the bass drum, it's not because I was looking for a low, oh, what is the lowest instrument and that will be good with the flute. That's not how I hear it, and I really see that as characters, as people.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
No, please.
I was going to say that I think the question is really great, particularly in this instance, because the combination of visual artist and composer has always been at the root of sonic exploration. You think of somebody like Kissinger, who was creating new sounds by scraping the soundtrack part of film in the 1930s. So the composers in the kind of Western classical canon were always following a little bit people like Russolo or the futurists in Italy and all of the sculptors who were actually creating the kind of brave new world of noises. So your question is really apt to this instance. Are there other thoughts, questions, comments? Yes, please, Madam.
Sometimes when I listen to music, I hear the rhythm of a horse if we're on horseback, or if I've been in a boat, the kind of rhythm of how fast the boat. Could you talk a little bit about rhythm inspirations and your composition?
The question about rhythm inspiration for Tamar is rhythms based on natural sounds, boats, horses. The opening of Beethoven's Seventh is the sound of horses galloping. So do you have that connection with rhythm in nature or rhythm in sources?
No, I mean, most of the rhythm really come from my gut feelings. I must say now in this piece that has also the visual, I've programmed all the visual that the mirror does, and sometimes by just experimenting, I said, okay, I like this one, I will use this one, and then that triggers musical ideas, and then the musical ideas trigger back. Now I want the mirror to do that. So it's hard to say. I mean, these rhythms are just, I let myself be really intuitive, and of course it's organized and with proportions and stuff. But yeah, it's pretty much intuitive.
Excellent question. We have time for one more, please, or maybe even two more, as I said.
Like an auction.
Where are you now, Danny? If this was 1999.
Well, I get to circle. I'm back where I was in 1999. This piece that we're seeing here, the sculpture is actually sculpture number one in this series that I call Mechanical Mirrors, which are these kinetic sculptures. And since I have created over 100 of those, of different variations, sizes, techniques, and the thing that I'm diving in this year for the first time, very excited about, the wooden mirror that you will see on stage today reproduces sort of a black and white image, or a relief of some sort. And the ones that I'm now developing this year actually reproduce full color. So that's a whole new complex thing, and also something that makes me excited. Every year I think maybe this year is the year to stop creating these mirrors, but apparently not. I still have a few in store.
Michael, the last question is yours.
Steve, I'm wondering how much of this piece is of the moment, extemporaneous? And ironically, how do you prepare to be extemporaneous?
Those are two really, really good questions. The piece consists of three movements, and the outer movements, the first and the third, are completely scripted almost without improvisation. The very final little burst is improvised in the percussion part. But the second movement, the entirety of my interaction with the mirror the first time around, and a brief cadenza in the third movement are extemporaneous, you see. And so how do you train to be free is a really, really good question. And there are probably lots of answers to that, including that one doesn't think about it that much. That in fact, that if you prepare with a sort of a list of things you would like to do, then it will really feel like you're checking things off. At least it does to me, checking things off in your mind. That being said, I think that the structure for me is a little bit like devising a lexicon of possible behaviors from which, if you're lucky, a language can emerge. So if you have concepts, sort of almost grammatical concepts, and now I'm not talking about actual language, I'm talking about physical language, some physical gestures, that if you can develop a lexicon that is rich enough, then something interesting will come out. But it really does involve shutting off that part of your brain that says, okay, what comes next? Which, by the way, is an essential part of the brain when you're reading notated music or playing from memory. And so it is an interesting switch back and forth, mentally speaking. Thank you for that question. Friends, first of all, we're really grateful to the La Jolla Music Society for having brought this piece here. This is the world premiere, so let's hear it for them. I always find that commissioning a new piece of music is the most optimistic thing a culture can do, because it presupposes the existence of future audiences that will care about what we think, where we are, and how we're living right now. So at this moment of birth of a new piece, let's imagine audiences in the future who do not have to wear masks, who are not afraid to hug, and who can go to concerts freely, and that day I hope will come soon. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Tamara.